Hello and welcome back to the conversation here, breaking the consensus and protect life. Today, I'm really happy. We're going to be talking to Sophie Trist. Sophie works for a group called Democrats for Life. They're a pro-life advocacy group in the United States working within the Democratic Party. So before we start, I'd just like to remind you, there's the subscribe button is there. If you click on that, any new material, any new work we're doing, you'll automatically be advised about it. Also, as you know, we've got a lot of campaigns at the moment. We've some very serious campaigns facing into us. There's legislation coming up that we need to work to inform people about and to oppose. So the donate button is there. If you can give something to help us, we can promise you that we will use it to the best of our abilities, the most efficient way we can. And anything you can give will be really appreciated and will be a help. So, Sophie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sophie, can we start off can you just talk a little bit about your own personal story and maybe first of all, how you came to your pro-life story and how you came to work with pro-life, the Democrats for Life?
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic. I was born in Louisiana, a very Catholic and pro-life state. So I've always been pro-life, but until I went to college, it wasn't really something that I thought too much about. But then when I went to Loyola University, New Orleans, my best friend said, "Hey, I'm going to found a pro-life student group here, want to help?" And I was like, "Sure, let's do it," because I was, looking for things to do at university. And founding that pro-life student group, obviously there were ups and downs and bumps in the road, but it was one of the greatest things I've ever done. And that led me to learn more about the consistent life ethic, which the consistent life ethic basically says every human life, from the unborn child to the immigrant to the death row inmate, the elderly or disabled person, all of them have inherent value.
Mm-hmm.
Abortion is one life issue that we talk about, but it's part of a larger, Catholics call it the seamless garment, where we also talk about ending the death penalty, humane immigration policies, supporting pregnant people. And through the consistent life ethic is when I became acquainted with groups like Rehumanize International, New Wave Feminists, and of course, Democrats for Life of America. I graduated from Loyola, New Orleans in May of 2020, and since I wasn't helping run the pro-life student group anymore, and with the pandemic, I was kind of at loose ends, just looking for ways to continue my whole life activism. And I happened to see that DFLA was looking for volunteers. So I applied for them in June or July, I can't remember exactly. And I've been working with them ever since. And I am now the messaging director for DFLA. So I basically write just different blog posts and social media content and stuff for the website and things like that.
Sophie, can I ask you? You graduated this year, so you are very much the new generation of students. Now, Loyola is, I understand, a Catholic university. So
Yeah.
you might have certain ideas, but within the student body, within your peer group, your cohorts, what was the attitude to you and to the pro-life groups? Was it generally supportive, or did you meet with hostility?
We got some support, but the reaction, I'm sorry to say, was mostly negative. When we did a Memorial of the Innocents my junior year, which that's where we set up flags to represent the number of babies aborted in the U.S. each day. We had people shouting profanity around our display. We had people trying to rip our flags out of the ground. Any time that we did an abortion-related event, it was always triggering and upsetting to the students. When I don't know how much y'all know about the New York Reproductive Freedom Act.
Mm-hmm.
Very terrible abortion extremist bill. But when that passed, our student newspaper covered it and they interviewed me, but they did it in a very biased way. It was like, oh, let's have 17 quotes from pro-choice people and one quote from a pro-life person. So I am sorry to say that even though Loyola is a Catholic school, we got those kind of hostile reactions.
What about the authorities, the university itself, say the chaplaincy or the university faculty? Did they help out? Did they support?
Again, we had some faculty members that would try to put up roadblocks whenever we did something, but we did have some faculty support, and the fact that the student body did try to form a pro-choice group at Loyola, but the faculty did put a stop to that and say, Loyola believes in the sanctity of human life. So the support was there, but it wasn't as strong as it could have been.
Okay. I think something that is puzzling for people outside of the United States and outside your politics is, if we go back to the 1960s, say, many of the most prominent pro-life leaders were people on the left or progressives or Democrats. People like Martin Luther King, famously Jesse Jackson, as a young man, was a pro-life activist. And many Republicans, particularly say Northeastern Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans. Republicans weren't particularly pro-life. This wasn't part of the thing. But something happens in the party, in politics, where abortion becomes this polarizing identifier. I don't know if you have any sense of why that happens historically, but if you do, I'd be interested in your idea, or what the situation is today. How polarizing is it today?
I'm by no means an expert, but what happened was in the 60s, the people that were leading our premier feminist organization, the National Organization for Women, they sort of, and it was a minority of people, but they somehow basically hijacked feminism and sort of married it to the idea of abortion rights. And when feminism became synonymous with abortion rights and Roe was ruled constitutional by our Supreme Court, that led to the Christian right sort of monopolizing the pro-life stance and taking it away from its progressive roots over time. And that's why Democrats for Life of America exists, is to kind of bring that progressive ideology back into the pro-life movement. You know, we're here to say not all pro-lifers are straight, white, able-bodied Trump supporters. That's the way that the pro-choice movement portrays us, but that's not the reality. And the Democratic Party, up until very recently, had a big tent approach. The language in the DNC's 2002 party platform recognizes that Americans have diverse views on the abortion issue, and it basically calls for dialogue and respect for all views. But in the 2020 platform that they just published this summer, calls for abortion basically on demand, without apology, taxpayer funded. And that's a position that is very extreme, even among the Democratic base. 60% of Americans support the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal tax dollars from going to abortion. And what I find even more interesting is that 40% of Democratic women, like myself, support Hyde. So the embracing abortion extremism and basically using abortion as a litmus test for any Democratic politician is a losing issue for the party.
That's the thing, that just looking at it from a political perspective, we know that first with Nixon and then Reagan solidified what they call, what became to be known as the Southern strategy.
Yeah.
And the South had been traditionally a Democrat stronghold. Mm-hmm. And the South was also culturally more conservative than the Northeast and the West Coast. But take a state, your own state, like Louisiana. You had until recently Senator John Breaux, who was a prominent pro-life Democrat. And is it not alienating politically for Democrats in states like Louisiana, like Alabama, in the South, where that kind of uncompromising position, abortion without apology, state funded, is that not politically problematic for Democrats in the South, in states like Louisiana?
I mean, I think it's problematic for Democrats everywhere, but I think especially in the South. And one of the many reasons that I'm proud to be from Louisiana, other than the fact that we have awesome food down here, is that we are a pro-life Democratic stronghold. I'm not as familiar with Senator John Breaux. I'm pretty young and just started paying attention to the political scene recently. But our current governor, John Bel Edwards, is a pro-life Democrat. And Senator Katrina Jackson is very prominent. He's a Black pro-life Democrat. He's amazing. Mm-hmm. And in this past election, Louisiana actually passed an amendment to our state constitution, which guarantees that abortion and the funding of abortion cannot be found in our state constitution, basically protecting pro-life legislation in our state. And what I found especially amazing about that is that that amendment received more votes in Louisiana than any candidate or ballot measure in the state's history.
Wow.
So the amendment got far more votes in Louisiana than Trump did. So it wasn't just Republicans who were voting for it.
Sure. I think I have to say, I think it must be a hell of a lot easier, I imagine, if you're a young pro-life activist in the Republican Party in Alabama or Tennessee than to be a young woman like yourself who is in the Democrats. It must take a degree of courage to be in. When you go to Democratic meetings or you're in contact with other Democrats throughout the United States, how do they react to you as a young a pro-life Democrat woman?
I mean, I guess it does take some courage. And again, I only became involved with DFLA over the summer, so it's not like I've been to a lot of meetings.
Sure.
But I've had people react with confusion, when I post online about, supporting LGBTQ rights or, Black Lives Matter, and then I turn around and say I'm pro-life. It definitely confuses some people.
Mm-hmm.
I've gotten some people say, oh, you hate women. I've had one, this was when I was still a student and before I started working with DFLA, but I think it is still relevant. My group signed up to do this disability rights event, and the main organization sponsoring the event knew we were pro-life and they were fine with it. But then another group pitched a fit and exerted pressure to get us kicked out of the event, even though it had nothing to do with abortion. And even though I explained to them, like, look, we are not, a stereotypical pro-lifer, but it didn't matter because we disagreed on one thing. We were evil incarnate.
Dear.
So I get some of that, but I also get some understanding. I have a lot of liberal friends, and I have people who are like, I still don't agree with you on abortion, but I appreciate that you're consistent, that you do all this other stuff for death penalty abolition and immigrant justice and racial justice. So even if I don't, change their mind on abortion, I think being more progressive and having a whole life approach can establish common ground and help people think in a different way. I have had 2 or 3 people tell me that just listening to me and talking to me has changed their mind on abortion. And even knowing that I've helped 2 or 3 people see the light is very encouraging when I'm dealing with the hateful comments. That kind of gets me through.
Cool. So can you talk just a little bit about the kinds of approaches or strategies that the Democrats for Life are using to try and to get their message across?
So I guess one of the things that we want to do is demonstrate that we're consistent. So, like, if you look on our website, democratsforlife.org, you'll see on there that we have information about abortion, but we also have information on the death penalty, climate change, because we believe that climate change is a pro-life issue because it affects maternal health, it affects infant health and mortality, and our ability to sustain human life. We're adding a section on paid family leave. It's appalling that America is only one of 5 countries in the world without family leave, and how that impacts maternal health, and it will just enable women to actually keep an unplanned pregnancy if they don't. Financial insecurity is one of the main reasons that people choose abortion. So it's not enough to make abortion illegal, although the legislative strategy is, of course, important. We also have to make it unthinkable and unnecessary. And for us, that involves those government policies that make it easier for poor families to thrive. And we just don't see the Republicans expanding the social safety net in the ways that we would like. Another thing that we point out is that, like, being pro-life sticks with the Democratic ideology because the Democrats are for the little person, for human rights for all human beings and the most marginalized. And I mean, who's more marginalized than a preborn child who can't speak for herself? So to just point out the hypocrisy of you can't exclude certain human beings from being people, that's just inherently undemocratic. Also, as I mentioned earlier, is pointing out that abortion extremism is unpopular even among the Democratic base. 70% of Americans, or it might be even 75%, support at least some form of abortion restriction. And even if they're not 100% pro-life, we can reach them with education because we know that they're uncomfortable with abortion, or that they don't see it as a positive good, which is the direction that the Democratic Party is heading. So if they want to win elections in the future, they need to abandon these positions that are wildly out of step with most Americans.
Would you say that the strategy increasingly for pro-life groups like yourselves is to try and work at a state level rather than a federal level, and to achieve victories at a state level?
I mean, that's certainly important, but we're certainly not abandoning our federal efforts. In fact, there is a congressional race in Louisiana that's potentially coming up because a Democratic congressman is going into Joe Biden's cabinet, so we're going to try to get a pro-life Democrat into the National House of Representatives. So I would say both are important.
Can you speak to some kind of, you see on the website there, they talk about some of the victories you've had. Is there any victory that you can think of, or any particular that you'd like to talk about or tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, it's the fact that 80 of our pro-life Democrats won election, and that's everything from the local and state level. I can't think of one candidate specifically, but it's the fact that, we had 80 candidates win, and you can see a full list of those 80 on our website. Mm-hmm. But one representative that I'm especially proud of is Colleen Gary from Massachusetts. He is currently being very vocal in opposing extremist pro-abortion legislation in Massachusetts right now.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that you have a very important outreach to the African American community. I mean, it has been commented on, and I don't know if you would agree with this, that there is, at the very least, a racist subtext to abortion provision in the United States. And there's a sense that African American communities and poorer communities generally have been targeted and for abortion in a way that the upper middle class suburbs have not.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, and part of it goes back to, people always like to talk about how Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a racist and ableist and eugenicist, and that is true. But I think it also goes back to the racism that's embedded in American society, the stigma around African American mothers and, they just want to have more kids so they can get on welfare. And, the ideal mother is depicted as a white, able-bodied, middle-class woman. So the stigmas around motherhood and the horrific Black maternal mortality rate in the U.S., I think also contributes to that.
And that's part of you. I mean, I just want to go back a little bit to this, the whole life message, because as would you see, for example, the mortality rates for pregnant women, particularly in minorities and lower incomes, as that's part of this wider issue, that it's not just, it's pro-life, it's about supporting babies, but about mothers, etc.
I mean, because you can't, it's almost like committing the same mistake that the pro-choicers commit on the other side. You can't say, I only care about the baby and not the mother. Whereas pro-choicers, you can't say, I only care about the pregnant person and the unborn child isn't human. It's hypocritical to have what we call fetal tunnel vision. Obviously, we talk a lot about the unborn child because he has been erased from the narrative. But it is important to have that holistic approach, because that's the only way that we're ever going to build a society that respects all human life.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're facing into a Biden presidency. I think everybody now is pretty well everybody's accepted that Joe Biden won the election. How do you see Joe Biden? I think himself says it's hard to get a sense. It seems to be equivocal. In one sense, he says he's a practicing Catholic and he's personally pro-life, but he has supported pretty radical, hard-line abortion rights legislation. How do you see a Biden presidency developing from the pro-life perspective?
I'm anxious. And let me just put this out there. I did vote for Biden, but it wasn't so much that I liked him, is that I disliked Trump, and I thought that he was very harmful to American democracy and just the consistent life movement, with his racist rhetoric and behavior. But DFLA did not endorse any presidential candidate this cycle, because we would only publicly endorse a candidate who was both pro-life and a Democrat. Some of our members voted third party. Some of us voted for Biden. We're definitely anxious and we're mobilizing, but I'm also cautiously optimistic, especially if the Republicans keep the Senate in January. That will hopefully prevent the Democrats from passing anything too extreme. And I know we're going to lobby very, very hard for the Hyde Amendment. Mm-hmm. And my hope is that Biden, now that he won, will kind of gravitate more towards the center. That certainly seems to be what he's doing with his cabinet picks. So I guess you could describe my mood as anxious but cautiously optimistic.
There has been inevitably some speculation that we may see a Kamala Harris presidency. For those of us, people outside the United States who have no sense of Kamala Harris, where would she fall on the life issue? What kind of perspective would she bring?
Kamala is extremely pro-abortion. She is actually responsible for prosecuting David Daleiden. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
For any of your viewers who are not, David Daleiden runs the Center for Medical Progress, and he is famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to, mm-hmm. for shooting undercover videos in Planned Parenthood to expose fetal trafficking. And Kamala Harris is responsible for a lot of the persecution he's facing, which is horrifically ironic because he praised animal rights activists who used a lot of the same tactics. So it's very hypocritical. But I personally think that the chances of a Harris presidency are 1 in a million. And this is my perspective as a disabled person. I feel like those speculations are a bit ableist in a way, because yes, Joe Biden is elderly and he's the oldest president that we've had, but he's by no means at death's door.
No.
And I feel like this characterization of him as, weak and feeble is kind of ableist and not true.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we have, I think, been discussing and thinking about over here since the change in the laws in Ireland has been the necessity to form alliances around this issue. I follow and I'm a member of a number of pro-life groups, in many of whom are in the United States. Say, coming from a secular perspective, atheists for life, agnostics for life, and that there's a sense that we need that for people for whom the life issue is a very central and important one. Do you think, or is it naive to think that in the United States there could be some kind of inter-party, cross-party pollination on working on this issue between Democrats, between Republicans, religious, non-religious, atheists, secularists?
That is the intersection that DFOA is working in. We have members who are moderates like myself. We have members who identify as democratic socialists. I'm a Catholic, but we have members who are atheists. And we do work with Republicans, on legislative things. We've have coalitions with other pro-life groups on both the conservative and the liberal side of the spectrum. So I think the pollination is certainly possible. America is at a very polarizing time right now.
Mm-hmm.
There have been polls showing that people identify based more on who their enemies are than on what they themselves believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of my personal hopes for the end of the Trump presidency, is that, again, America is kind of gravitate more toward a centrist point of view where that dialogue and cross-pollination is more likely.
Talking to friends, one of the things talking about polarization, that one of the issues, whatever people actually think, or if they think at all about it, is that abortion has become or became like a shibboleth or a password for the, shall we say, for the left and for the right. But that the work that you are doing in Democrats for Life is central to the idea of moving abortion out of that space, so that more and more people can feel comfortable with and have the courage, perhaps, to say, okay, I'm a Democrat, I'm a progressive, but I'm also pro-life. And therefore, to shift that sense that it is an inevitable connection, to take it out of the polarization.
Yeah. And this isn't exactly related to what you were saying, but it just occurred to me, and I want to hear it with your viewers. Being that, almost 50% of Americans identify as pro-life and 3/4 may not identify as pro-life, but do support at least some form of abortion restriction. Being pro-life comes with immense political capital. It's still early to make sweeping conclusions, but there is data suggesting that pro-life candidates overall, especially in more rural and south and southwest areas, had a 5-point advantage in the election. And we don't want the Republican Party to have a monopoly on that, especially because, some of them, a lot of them, are genuinely pro-life and, work toward a world free of abortion. But also, and this may sound cynical, but it benefits the Republicans, and I would say both parties, but it benefits the Republicans to keep abortion a controversial issue because it keeps people voting for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's if nothing else, it gets the base out, it gets the base excited, gets people motivated. So I just want to ask one question before we finish up. I've seen some data recently suggesting something which might be surprising to some people, that your generation is more pro-life than the previous generations of young people are more pro-life. They're less religious but more pro-life. And I think that's if that direction is an interesting one. How hopeful do you feel? I'm not saying for today or for tomorrow, but in the long run of history, how hopeful do you feel? How optimistic are you?
So I've seen conflicting data on that. I've seen, what you said, that millennials and Gen Z are less religious and more pro-life. I've also seen that we are trending more pro-choice because of the decrease in religion. But I like to think that some of that is, again, people don't understand that you can be progressive and pro-life.
Sure.
Just because they haven't encountered us, and we're not yet as, large as some of the more conservative pro-life groups, but we're working on it. And I think a secular scientific pro-life argument is the way of the future. With ultrasound technology improving at a rapid rate, the humanity of the unborn is becoming ever more apparent. And with medical technology advancing, the age of viability is decreasing, and they're able to help children in the womb, do surgery on them. So my hope is that with these advancements, the humanity of the unborn will become more obvious, and people will be like, wait, if they're doing surgery on it, it must be a human being.
Yeah.
And I'll lead them to a conclusion. I think that the arc of history bends toward progress and justice. So I'm hopeful that, 10, 20 years from now, we will be seeing a more progressive and whole life society.
Okay. Sophie, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and for talking to us. I wish you the very best of luck. I think you're doing a great job, and I compliment you personally, I think, for what you're doing and the great courage. I'd like to thank our viewers for joining us. Again, I'd like to remind you to hit the subscribe button, and if you would like to support us in our campaigns, I'd invite you. You see the donate button. If anything you can give would be greatly appreciated and will make a difference. But for today, I'd like to say, well, in these difficult times, take care, mind yourself. Sophie, yourself, mind yourself, keep yourself safe and healthy, and keep doing the good work. And our prayers and our blessings go out to you. Thank you very much.